think it was at the tail end of last year, for the first time, the West assessed that Russia was losing more people than it could recruit. And that is really interesting because Russia, under Yevgeny Prigozhin, was using the Wagner group of convicts. Then he was pulling people in from North Korea. Then he was pulling people from around the world, promising them large amounts of money, but saying you won't get deployed to the front line. But as soon as they arrived in Russia, they were sent straight through to the front line. That was all very short term. Now, people have recognised they may get paid well, but they won't live to enjoy spending that money. So, and the economy for Russia, although the lifting of oil sanctions isn't helpful, but it's still making life increasingly difficult for President Putin. So the real question is, what is Russia actually seeking to achieve? If it keeps grinding on, it is more likely that it will be vulnerable to a Ukrainian clever counterattack somewhere. And President Putin will not want that to happen. And if I was President Putin's military advisor at the moment, which I like to sort of sit there, I think I'd be saying to him, Putin will be stroking his cat on his lap, a bit like one of the baddies in the Bond films, and just saying, keep doing what you're doing. You wanted to tackle NATO. Well, NATO seems to be falling apart at the moment. You wanted to make Russia great again, and actually you are making progress. And it may be messy, it may be taking a lot longer than you wanted to, but President Trump doesn't look like he wants to get involved and stop you. And European leaders still look as if they're trying to find a solution without getting their hands dirty. So I think this summer will be really critical because I can't speak for Russia, but if they are planning a big major offensive, I think that might create some really interesting challenges for Ukraine. It'll also create some opportunities for Ukraine. Because as a military guy, if you want to do a major offensive, you have to bring your forces together to push in one area. If you pull your forces together, you leave yourself vulnerable. And of course, with the West's eyes and ears watching over the battlefield, then it's quite possible that Russia will leave itself vulnerable. But yeah, that's a long way of saying at the moment, Russia is still moving forward, and that's not a good sign.
You also just mentioned about Russia's recruitment problems. This is right information that they lost more soldiers than they were able to recruit and get to the fight. Moreover, according to U.S. Institute of Study of War, Ukraine regained more territory than it lost in late February 2026 for the first time since this counteroffensive in 2023. Don't you think that these dynamics don't look great for Russia, for long war, for attrition?
Well, okay, so I agree with the headlines you've just quoted about that Ukraine took back territory. But if you look what it took back, the Institute of Studies of War is very clear that villages and towns have strategic value. Fields do not. And if you start linking up villages that Russia has taken and all of the fields around them, it looks like a big area. This was actually more of a mopping up operation by Ukraine. I'm not trying to undermine it. I think it's fantastic, but it wasn't of any strategic value. And as you know, when forces are moving forward, as Russia is doing, initially they're very vulnerable because they haven't dug their trenches. They don't have their supply lines. They don't have the communications laid. So the best time to do a counterattack is straight after the attack of your enemy because they're not settled in. And my understanding is that quite a lot of the territory was taken, just retaken quickly. Now, again, I think that's a really positive thing. It demonstrates that Ukraine is not just walking backwards, it's also walking forwards. But again, you know that the side on the offense generally loses a lot more people than the team on the defense, because defensively, you're in your trenches, looking out over the top, firing at anything that comes towards you. If you're on the offense, you have to get out of your trench and you have to charge at the enemy. You leave yourself very vulnerable. And Russian blockade forces will shoot the Russian soldiers if they turn around and run back. So you end up with very large casualties. If Ukraine was to go on the offensive and start to push Russia out, unless they cause a rout when Russia soldiers just run away, it actually could be very costly for Ukraine. And that's why there's a lot of military analysis that says the outcome of the war, if one of the outcomes is Ukraine pushes Russian soldiers out of all of Ukraine and Crimea, that's very, very unlikely to happen, because Ukraine just doesn't have the soldiers to do that. If it was pushing the soldiers out of all of Ukraine, but not Crimea, again, a very large area, very difficult to do. If it was to stop Russia and maybe push it back a bit, that would almost certainly stop President Putin, because he wouldn't want to risk losing all the territory that he had gained. And therefore, Ukraine might be able to create a line in the sand and somehow get the international community to provide those security guarantees to make sure Russia couldn't go any further. Now, how would you then get that territory back? That's a conversation for another day, because it's very difficult to see militarily, given the relative sizes, the relative strength. But as President Zelensky has said many times, and I think you and I have talked about, the priority is to stop the war. Another priority is to get the territories back, but the first priority is to stop the war and make sure that Russia can't come at Ukraine again. And I think that is something that the international community has been looking very carefully at, to see how it can help Ukraine. And I've seen quite a lot of advanced planning for that. Whether that includes America heavily or not, I don't know. But as soon as you put European soldiers in Ukraine to help deter Russia, I think that provides some pretty robust guarantees. We'll have to see.
While we're talking about possible security guarantees after the war ends, after the fighting ends, if Vladimir Putin does not want to end the war, he rejects all offers proposed by President Trump. Does this make any kind of sense, future planning for 10, 15 years?
Well, it is interesting, isn't it, as to, at the moment, again, if I was looking at this through Russia's lens, why would I stop? In fact, he has offered to stop if you give up the rest of the Donbass. Because I think Putin is confident that he will eventually take Kramatorsk and the remaining cities of the Donbass. But it might take him a couple more years to do it. I think that's what he believes. If he also believes that President Trump wants the war to stop and will force President Zelensky into doing a deal, why on earth would President Putin even hint that he wants to stop the war? Because he will be wanting to get everything he can out of this. And at the moment, he'll believe he's in a very strong position. He'll believe he's in a strong position because he will believe that he can take the rest of the Donbass in a couple of years. He also believes that President Trump is more favorable to Putin than he is to Zelensky. And whilst he believes that, why would he negotiate? Why would he stop?
Do you feel that he is in a strong position? Maybe this is also about performance, and he would like to pretend to be in a strong position at home and abroad?
Well, I'm not sure he's in a strong position, but I think he believes he is. My worry here is that President Trump, I just can't quite understand why the American president has blamed Volodymyr Zelensky for the war, why he blames Zelensky for not doing a deal, surrendering. He doesn't understand, and I don't understand why. Because if President Trump was to provide Tomahawk missiles to Ukraine, if President Trump was to give long-range weapons to Ukraine, it would tilt the war in Ukraine's favour and would make life very difficult for President Putin. So why doesn't he do it? And I'm worried that some of the answer to that is that he believes that European countries have been freeloading on America under NATO for many years, that he believes that America, their new national security strategy in America talks about America first, talks about the Western Hemisphere. And it explains why Trump went into Venezuela. It explains why Trump was threatening Denmark over Greenland. And if Trump, who no longer sees China as the enemy, but China as the Eastern Hemisphere is China's, then all of a sudden, America, Western Hemisphere, China, Eastern Hemisphere, this Middle Earth becomes a fight between Russia and Europe. Why would America get involved in that? It's not my fight. And my worry is that I sort of can understand that, but what I don't understand is why he then blames Zelensky for being the one who's been invaded by another country, but blaming him for not resolving it. So all of those things, I think, contribute to President Putin feeling emboldened at the moment.
You just mentioned about Tomahawk missiles. We have been hearing these discussions for a while about specific type of equipment Ukraine really needs, but would several Tomahawk missiles really change the game of this war?
Well, I think the question is, what would change the game in the war? And I've spent quite a while talking to military colleagues about this. And I think part of it is that if you look back to the start of this war, and it's difficult to cover it in a few sound bites, but the 40-mile convoy approaching Kyiv, Russian military might against a small country like Ukraine. I don't think the West ever really expected Ukraine to be able to withstand that initial Russian onslaught, but you did. Your courage, your professionalism, your tenacity, your sacrifice did. But the West then had to work out, Ukraine isn't a member of NATO, so why should we get involved? Because we don't want to fight with Russia. And it took a long time before we agreed to provide anti-tank weapons. And then some time later, after lots of, I'm not sure, we gave tanks. So the UK, Challenger 2s, we offered those, and eventually the Leopards were offered. Later than that, we started offering long-range missiles like Storm Shadow. And it was another period of a year or so before we provided F-16s. If you look back, if only we'd made those decisions rather quicker, would the war's outcome have been different? And if you look at today through that same lens, if the war goes on for a year, 2 years, 3 years more, what else will we do that if we did now and not in 3 years' time would help make the difference? And for me, one of the big changes has been that when Russia initially invaded, it wasn't really our war. It was on the European continent, but it didn't feel like our war. Now that America feels like it's walking away from NATO, now that it feels like Russia is emboldened, now that we look more closely at how much military capability the West has in Europe, individual countries, I think the Russian threat is now not just a threat to Ukraine, but also a threat to Europe. Now, you'd probably say to me, we've been telling you that from the start. And I'd agree with you, but I do think our politicians are starting to feel it more. I was supporting an event in the Polish embassy last week. They feel the heat of Russia's invasion, not only through the lens of history, but also today. And that's why they're spending money, they're developing capability, they're working with the Ukrainians to understand the lessons you have learned. I don't think this country feels the heat quite the same way. But now that with America wobbling on NATO, I think we're seeing a lot more conversations at the senior political and military level going, we can't just watch and let Ukraine lose. Of course we're not doing that. But what more could we do? And I think things like air power, providing a no-fly zone, things like long-range missiles, not putting combatants in, but I think there are ways in which we could change the threat that Putin sees, because he knows what Ukraine has. He knows what your limits are. He knows that you have fewer soldiers than he does, and therefore he just wants a grinding war of attrition, because he will win if that happens. The more the West was providing technology, I think that would just move the dial a bit and potentially create some interesting opportunities, specifically if Ukraine was to be able to mount a surprise attack on Crimea, for example, and threaten taking Crimea back. I think that will be a strategic disaster for President Putin. If he even thought that that was possible, I think he'd be looking over his shoulder going, hang on a minute, we need to start negotiating, because I can't afford to lose Crimea. That is, for all sorts of historical reasons and strategic reasons, it's really important. So it's a long answer, but I do think the West now feels more that this is not just a threat to Ukraine, it's a threat to Europe, in which case, what do we need to do about it?
Should NATO members have closed the sky over Ukraine since the day one of this war? Should have they joined this war in 2022? Would this make a difference?
Well, it would have made a difference. I've no doubt about that. Western air power, Russia has no answer to Western air power. So I think it would have made a difference. As an older military guy, I think I leave it to the historians to decide what might or might not have been done and what the consequences might have been. As a military guy, I tend to look at now and look forward. I can't change what's happened. What we have to do is learn the lessons from what's happened to influence what we do into the future. When this war is over, I think it will be a very good opportunity to look back and decide, we have given a lot of missiles, we have given tanks, we have given F-16s. If they had been given earlier, would that have created an opportunity for Ukraine to do different things? Possibly, yes. Would that have changed the outcome of the war? Who knows? That's for academics to decide. And also, even today, my last visit to Ukraine, I was talking to some of the guys flying your F-16s. We operate in the West our aircraft very differently than Ukraine operates them. You don't have an independent air force, so your army units hang on to your aircraft and use them in a very different way than an independent air force like ours, like the Americans, operate. And there is a view that the F-16 could offer some really interesting opportunities for Ukraine if it was to be used in a certain way, rather than being the way it is. But to be brutally honest, it's not my war, it's your war. You have some incredibly brave and professional people fighting, and it's not for us to tell you how to fight a war. But we do use our resources and our assets in a different way than you are used to. And I do think that's where there would be the opportunity to create real advantage for Ukraine.